All right, we're going to continue on with A Dog Called Kitty by Bill Wallace. We had a lot of problems with Ricky and his friends, and we found out why he is so scared of dogs. So let's go on with chapter 5 and see what's happening now. It was almost bedtime before anyone came up to see me. Mama sent Chucky in to get his pajamas. And while he was messing around in the bathroom, she got down on the edge of my bed. "I'm sorry," she said, patting my forehead. "Your father really tries to understand how you feel about dogs, but, well, he just can't." She sighed and looked out the window. I was looking out the window too. Not that there was anything new to see. It was because I was feeling kind of ashamed of myself, and I didn't want to look her square in the eye. "I know I shouldn't have sassed him," I admitted. "But it really isn't my fault. I can't help being scared around dogs. He ought to understand about that. He ought to know how I feel. I bet if he'd been chewed on by one of those dogs when he was little, he'd understand." Mama acted like she was wanting to say something, only she changed her mind. We sat quiet for a time. Finally, she eased up from the bed. "I better go check on Chucky. He's probably got water running over the top of the bathtub by now." At the door, she paused and looked back at me. "I don't think your father's mad at you. He's a little hurt, that's all. I think it's hurt his feelings to know his son would talk to him like you did." I bit down on my bottom lip. "I know I shouldn't have done it, Mama. I'm sorry. It's only, well," she gave me a knowing smile. "I understand. I think your father does too. Still, he is right. Fear is something that you got to overcome. You can't let it run your life. There's too many dogs in this world for you to run from. If you keep running, you'll be so busy running that there won't be time for anything else." I looked up at her and I wanted to say something, argue with her, or say I was sorry again. Only I just lay there and watched her leave. Leaving me alone in my room was about the worst kind of punishment, being alone. I had plenty of time to think. When you're right, the thinking isn't too bad. But when you know that your dad and mama are right and you're wrong, well, thinking that over is awful painful. Sleep didn't come quick that night. I did a lot of tossing and turning and could never quite get comfortable. Morning came awful early too. I felt like I'd barely gotten to sleep when this terrible squealing and yelping and hissing yanked me awake. I blinked a couple of times and sat up. The noise was coming from right under my window. Still half asleep, I stumbled over to see what was going on. Down below, out in the backyard, our 6 cats were all fuzzed up and squalling at that floppy-eared pup again. Fur and hair were flying every place, and there was so much noise a dead person couldn't have slept through it. Out of the corner of my eye, I saw Mama run out. She commenced swatting the cats with her broom and yelling at them. I reckon she was figuring on rescuing that pup. They all scattered when she flopped them. And when the pup saw the broom, he lit out too. Mama called after him and tried to coax him back to the bowl that she'd brought out just for him. Only that pup wasn't having no more of it. He went whining with his tail tucked between his legs. And once he looked back to see if anyone was chasing him, when he did, he stumbled over a dirt clod and went tumbling head over heels. From the look of his face when he got up, you'd have thought somebody chunked that clod at him. He yelped again and disappeared behind the barn. The cats didn't waste any time getting back to their feed. Mama kind of raised the broom like she wanted to take another swat at them. She didn't, though. I heard the screen door slam. In a few seconds, Dad came far enough into the yard that I could see him from up the upstairs window. I thought I saw that pup up in the barn the other day, he said. But when I went in there to run him out, I couldn't find him. Mama nodded. He started trying to get that cat food from about 4 days ago, she said. I don't reckon he'll stay much longer. Those thieving cats haven't let him eat a bite since he got here. Dad put his hands on his hips. Even from way down there, I could hear him sigh. That must be one tough little pup. At least 4 days without food. It's a wonder he can still get around. He shook his head. Shame people abandon a cute little pup like that. Downright shame. I don't understand why folks in town bring dogs out to the country and dump them, Mama said. It'd be kinder for them to take them to the pound. Kinder to hit them over the head with a club to let them starve to death. Dad nodded. Yeah, it's really getting to be a problem. Bill Priddle over by Lake Berchowski told me the other day that a pack of dogs got one of his newborn calves. Said he trailed about 7 of them until they got into the blackjack trees by the lake. Big dogs too, he said. Mama shook her head. It doesn't surprise me. I've driven that road before and seen up to 10 dogs. They were just strays somebody had dumped. They weren't running in a pack, though. Dad motioned to the barn. Won't have to worry about this little thing running around with a pack, he sighed. Fact is, much longer without food and he won't have to worry about him at all. Dad and Mom went back inside. I looked toward the barn where the pup had disappeared. It was a pleasant surprise to see Beauty standing there by the salt block. For over 2 weeks, my horse hadn't come near the house. She was a pretty good mare, gentle and all, but when it came to catching her in an open pasture, she could run me to death, and I'd still have to walk back to the house. Now was the perfect chance. If I could get dressed and close the corral gate before she had left the salt block, I'd have her trapped. I guess Beauty was as ready to go riding as I was. When I came around the side of the barn and headed for the gate, she didn't even try to outrun me or get away. She only stood there, swooshing her white tail. Once I had her locked in a small corral, catching her was no problem. Within 10 minutes, I had the bridle and saddle on, and we were headed for a whole day of fun. Riding Beauty was just the thing I needed after the trouble with Dad last night. First off, we rode over to Mr. Shaw's place and explored the canyon below the big pond, where there are some tall oak trees and possum grapevines hanging down. I tied Beauty up and climbed and swung on them a while. Then, before lunch, we came back to our place and herded the cows a while. That didn't last long. When Dad drove by in the truck, he caught us. Y'all two quit chasing my cows, he called. Gonna run all the fat off them. At lunch, there was nothing said about the cows. Nothing said about last night either. Maybe it was forgotten. After I finished eating, I rode to the big rock hill, northeast of our house. There was plenty of exploring to do there. Paths and trails the cows used, plum thickets, and red rock boulders to circle and hide behind. It was almost dark when we came in. I took Beauty down to the barn where Dad was. He told me it would be all right to keep her in the calf pen tonight, so I could ride again tomorrow. The oats were stored in the grain bin inside the hay barn. After I took the bridle off Beauty and made sure she had got a drink, I grabbed one of the cow feed buckets and lit out for the barn. All in all, it had been a beautiful day. Maybe all the troubles were all over for a while. But sure enough, the trouble started again when Mama rattled the pans down by the house and yelled, "Here, kitty, kitty, kitty!" I clean forgot about the stray pup who'd been fighting our cats. But when Mama yelled, I remembered him right quick. I was digging into the grain bin for a few oats when all of a sudden I heard this whining sound right beside me. It was kind of weak and far off. Then the next second I heard a bark and another whine. The sound of a dog sent the chills running through me. Without thinking, I dropped the bucket and slammed the lid of the grain bin and crawled up on top of it. The whining sound came again, and I figured the pup was down beside the bin someplace, only from up on top of the box like I was, I couldn't see him. Any minute I'd figured to see him running for the house, only the barking and jumping around he did this morning never came. He whimpered some more like a little baby crying than a dog yelping. It was a soft sound, far off, yet coming from some grain sacks right beside me. Then the whimpering stopped. Things got so quiet I could hear my stomach growling. There was a pitchfork hanging above the grain bin. I took it down. Reckon I was planning to take care of that pup once and for all. If it came tearing out of those sacks, barking and yapping at me, only he never did. After a long time, my curiosity got the best of me. I couldn't figure why he was being so quiet. So real careful, I leaned over the edge of the grain bin. With the handle of the pitchfork, I lifted some of the sacks. What I saw was enough to make me sick. The pup was there all right, nestled down in a place he'd hollowed out under the sacks. Only he didn't look much like the pup that he had chased me up on the haystack just 2 days ago. He was really skinny. His little head was laid over in the hay, and it seemed all he could do to raise it and look up at me. Those bright, mischievous eyes of his didn't dance and sparkle when he looked up. They looked sad, empty, almost hollow, like he'd given up hope. It was easy to tell from the first look that what was wrong with him. The little pup was might near starved to death. He was so thin I could count his ribs, and after he looked up at me, he had to put his head back down. That's how weak he was. Like I said, the sight of him almost made me sick. I don't like dogs, but he didn't look much like a dog anymore. He looked like something almost dead. An animal hurting, suffering, and I couldn't help feeling sorry for him, even if he was a dog. I hated to see an animal suffer, but maybe it was for the best. He darn sure couldn't stay around here, and if we ran him off, he'd only starve to death some place else. Maybe it was better for him to just die now. I grabbed the bucket of oats and headed out of the barn. He whimpered at me as I walked off, as if he was begging me to come back, to help him. I didn't look back. I knew what I was doing was for the best. Chapter 6. That's funny how you make your mind up to a certain thing, then turn right around and change it. For some reason, I couldn't sleep that night. Every time I closed my eyes, I couldn't see that skinny little pup looking at me with his big, sad brown eyes. And when I pulled the pillow around my head and tried to sleep, I could hear that weak, whimpering whine of his, begging for help. So a little past midnight, I snuck out of bed and went downstairs. It was dark in the kitchen, but with the yard light on outside, I could see my way to the icebox. There, I got a big bowl of milk and bacon, cheese and bologna scraps left over from the day's meals. Then I stumbled around on the back porch until I found the flashlight. Dad kept on the cabinet next to the deep freeze. The walk up to the barn was kind of spooky. Late at night, I could imagine all sorts of things lurking outside the shadowed light of the big yard lamp. Coyotes and bobcats, even a mountain lion. But I wasn't scared. With the flashlight in my hand, if I heard any sounds, all I had to do was shine the light to see what it was. The pup was in the grain bin, where I'd last seen him. He whimpered a bit, but I walked up and shined the light on him. I stood there a while just to make sure he wasn't going to jump up and bark at me. Then I knelt down and scooted the bowl of milk up close to his head. "Listen, dog," I said. "I still don't have any use for you. I hate dogs. Understand? It's only, well, I don't even want to watch a dog starve to death." He whined and tried to raise his head. All he could do was kind of cock one ear. I scooted the bowl up so close that it bumped him. But he was still so weak that he couldn't raise up to get at it. "I don't like doing this," I said, and felt the shivers run down my arms. "But I guess it's the only way to get you to eat." My arm was shaking something terrible. I managed to slide a hand under his head, and just knowing he was going to reach around and bite me, I was ready to take out running if he made the slightest move. His head felt wobbly in my hand. I raised it up and turned him so that his mouth could touch the milk. The minute I turned him, that dog's floppy tongue of his snapped out of his mouth and he went to work. I couldn't help smiling, the way he sucked up that milk faster than you could sneeze. Then I shoved the meat scraps over. The pup didn't exactly eat the meat. It was more like he was breathing it in. He'd chomp down on a double mouthful of bacon and swallow it before even chewing. It took about 10 seconds for him to polish off all the food I brought, and he was still hungry. All in all, I made 4 trips to the house for food, and that pup ate and ate. Gobbled up all the food till I just knew his little round tummy was gonna pop open at the seams. He was still whining for more when I left, but I was afraid to give him any more for fear that he might blow up. As I was fixing to leave, I reached to get the bowl. My hand grazed his nose, and that long pink tongue came flopping out. All wet and stinky, he licked at the back of my hand, whined as if to say, "Thanks." I glared down at him and tried to sound mean. "Listen, you mangy dog. You don't have anything to thank me for. Soon as you got enough food to get your strength back, I'm running you off. Understand? I don't like you and I don't want you around. Soon as you're well, that's it. Got me?" His little tail gave a weak wag. I scowled at him. "I mean it." And I did too. Only I guess he didn't believe me. Way I had things figured, as scraggly and sickly as he looked, it'd probably take 2 or 3 days for him to get on his feet. Then I'd get a stick or some chunkin' rocks and run his tail clean out of this place. Like I said, my mind was made up. There wasn't anything that could change it. 3 days later, the pup was on his feet. He looked awful wobbly though, and I figured if I ran him off, he couldn't get very far. So I kept feeding him 3 times a day, swiping scraps from our table and sticking them in a plastic baggie I stuffed in my pocket. Mama and Dad and Chucky never did catch me. I was real careful about that. Mama did remark once about how I was eating better. I just smiled and told her how good the homemade rolls were. Then when she turned her head, I stuffed another one into my plastic bag. The pup enjoyed everything I brought him. Never once did he stick up his nose at any of the scraps. He even liked green beans and corn on the cob. I can still remember the next time I touched him. It really wasn't my idea. Sometimes when I'd bring him his food, he'd get to wiggling and waggling his tail so hard that it shook him clear up to his ears. I was feeding him some scraps of bacon one morning when he got all wiggling so much he clean knocked himself over. He landed up against my knee and with his fuzzy head against my hand. Of course, I was on my feet and gone in a second, clean up on the top of the grain bin, fast as I could scoot. Only the shaking and being afraid didn't take hold of me like I figured. I wasn't trembling all over. I wasn't going through the sick feeling in my stomach and that I usually got whenever I was around a dog. This time, it was different. "You stay back," I warned as I climbed down from the grain bin. "Eat and leave me alone, or I'll... I couldn't figure anything mean enough to finish the threat with. Besides, he had already gone back to the bacon. It was 2 days later that I finally got up the courage to touch him on purpose. It took a lot of doing. My hand was shaking something terrible when I touched his fuzzy back. I yanked it away really quick. Only this time, I didn't run. I didn't climb up to the safety of the grain bin either. Instead, I touched him again. For about a week, I felt big and brave as anything. I figured just by touching him, I was all over the fear and panic that had hung on to me for so long. The real test was yet to come. Mama's meatloaf was about the most favorite thing that pup could sink his teeth into. Even before I dump it out of the plastic sack into his feed bowl, he knew it was coming. He'd start bouncing around and yapping. This one time, I got tickled on the way he was acting and got to giggling. That only made him wiggle and yap more. I sat down beside the bowl and started to dump the meatloaf. All of a sudden, he bounced around and a couple of times and landed square in my lap. I froze stiff as a rock. Didn't even breathe. He got real still, too. Nothing moved except his eyes, which were on the meatloaf, and his tail, which couldn't stop wagging even if I wanted it to. Finally, I got enough courage to give him a good push. He went sliding on his nose across the feed sacks and into the bowl. And before I could so much as blink, he came running back and plopped in my lap again. I started to give him another shove, but for some reason, I reached into the plastic sack and got out a piece of meatloaf. Be my luck for him to chew my hand off when I offered the meat to him. I closed my eyes and he took it from me so light I didn't even feel his long floppy tongue. The next day, I fed him by hand again, and the next and the next. During those days, I never once told myself that I was going to keep him. I never said, I got me a dog now, and he'll help me so that I won't be scared of any more. I never thought of any of that stuff. Each day, as I was walking up the hill to the barn, I'd tell myself that he was probably strong enough that I could run him off. I'd get the pitchfork or a leather strap or some rocks, and I'd run him off once and for all. Then I'd get to the barn, and he'd be all wiggly and excited over what I'd brought him. He'd lick my hand and try to crawl up in my lap, and I'd end up shoving and playing with him, giggling and laughing all the while. Then I'd leave the barn and tell myself that tomorrow I'll run him off. Only tomorrow was the same thing, and so was the tomorrow after that. I never planned to keep him, that's for sure. It was one thing for those things that had happened. I still don't recollect how. All right, so that's the end of chapter 6, and we'll do chapter 7 and 8 next week. So until then, think what's going to happen in A Dog Called Kitty. Bye, kids.